Hello, my name is Xander and welcome to the cutting edge of API development in Python, some might suggest FastAPI. In this tutorial, I'm going to take you through a step-by-step process building an API with FastAPI. We're going to be implementing SQLAlchemy Alembic, PostgreSQL database, and then that's all going to be powered by Uvicorn, and we're going to build all of this in Docker containers. This definitely isn't going to be your typical beginner's tutorial where we cover things step by step. We will go through every single process. I'll give you some commentary on all of these different technologies as we work through them. So to give you an overview of exactly what it is we're going to be covering in this tutorial, so you can decide whether you want to follow this tutorial, we are going to be implementing a FastAPI API. It's going to be fairly basic. We are going to show you how to get data from your API, and then in addition to that, post data, so you can save data through your API to your database. So in this tutorial, we choose to use SQLAlchemy. That's going to allow us to develop our databases or tables in the background. We use Alembic to enable us to migrate our data to our database. We are and have selected Postgres database here with PGAdmin, the web administration tool that we can utilize to view and administrate our database. So I'll take you through that process. We will be utilizing Docker Compose here to set all this up in individual containers. And in addition to that, I will take you through multiple tables because sometimes tutorials only take you so far. I want to try and give you enough information about building tables so you can then scale it to whatever project you're working with, or at least give you a starting point. So we will have multiple tables here utilizing foreign keys. So as I've already touched upon, we will be also utilizing Docker here, Docker Compose, to set out our cluster of containers that we're going to build. So we will build 3 containers, one for Postgres, one for PGAdmin, and then third for our FastAPI. So in addition to that, I will cover and give you some information, which I kind of normally forget, a little bit of security here. So configuring environment variables throughout the project. So just finally, before we start, here I'm using Windows 10. This will work with Linux and Mac, so by all means utilize whatever operating system you want. There is just one stage here in this process that will be different for you, and I'll point that out as we go along. I am using Python 3.9. Now you can utilize Python 3 upwards. This should work absolutely fine. And finally, Docker. So just make sure you've got Docker installed before we start, as well as Python. Here, I'm just going to utilize Docker desktop as much as possible. Avoid utilizing command line, assuming again you're a beginner to Docker as well as Python and FastAPI development. For those who would like to, the first part of this tutorial, which you can skip, is a step-by-step guide downloading the code repository of the final product and getting it started. So this is a good point to start for some beginners because it gives you an opportunity just to get familiarized with the technologies that we're going to use. And it also, for beginners, it allows you to check that your tech is working before we actually go through the tutorial. Because probably the worst thing that can happen is you start a tutorial, you get through, it's taken an hour, and then you spend the next 10 hours actually trying to fix and resolve problems. So like I said, if you don't want that, that's not a problem. Just skip to part 2, and there we'll start with setting up Docker with Postgres and PGAdmin. Now again, if you are familiar with Docker, just head into the repository, grab the code for this component, and then you can move across to part 3. So I think we've covered everything at this point, so let's get started with part 1. I'm going to first of all take you through how to download the repository and get it started on your machine. You just need to make sure that you've got Docker installed, Python installed, and then ideally running Windows 10. So first up, there is a link in the video description which is going to take you to the code repository for this tutorial. This is the complete code here. So go ahead and download this. So I've gone ahead and downloaded it. I'm just going to extract this into a folder. This is going to be my working folder. So let's just grab that out. I prefer to work in a folder without such a large name. So I'm just going to remove it from there. So now we have all the files that we need. Just make sure we go into our Visual Studio Code. We're going to select this folder. So I've gone ahead with File, Open Folder. I've selected the folder where I've just placed all those files. And this is now my project folder. So here we go. So next up, we're going to build our virtual environment. So we're going to be working within a virtual environment. So if you are new to Python development and you're not too sure what a virtual environment is, just check it out on Google. Now, in addition to that, we are using Windows here. So the code is going to be very much orientated around Windows. So if you are using Linux or Mac at this point, the code will be slightly different here. So just go onto Google, type in virtual environment, Python, Mac or Linux, and then just grab the code from there. So here we're going to start a new virtual environment. We're going to create the files so that we can start a new virtual environment in a folder called VEMV. So we can call this folder whatever we want. I'm just going to call it VEMV so we know what we're working with. Okay, so that's going to take a couple of seconds. So what essentially has happened here is that Python's been installed in this new folder. A copy of Python has been installed in this folder, as well as some of the dependencies, for example, pip, so we can install some packages, for example. And now we're going to be working within this environment. So our project is going to run within this environment. The benefit of that, in addition to, for example, running this from our locally installed Python, is that once we start installing packages, etc., if we have multiple projects running, it can cause problems because we want different versions of packages and different packages. So it gets untidy really quickly. So this way, we're creating a smaller instance, individual instance of Python so we can run our project within this small virtual environment. So let's go ahead now and start this up. So we need to, I'm just pressing tab here. So we need to activate it. You can see when we activate our virtual environment, we now have the VEMV to indicate the fact that we're now working within our virtual environment. So at this point, we're now going to bring in Docker. So if you haven't already installed it, now's a good time to install Docker. So this is Docker Desktop. Like I said in the preview, we're going to be utilizing mainly the Docker Desktop here rather than command line. It just makes it easier for beginners to introduce them to Docker, and it gives us kind of visual clues here to understand what exactly is happening if you're not familiar with Docker. So what you find in the repository are two files, Docker file and Docker Compose. In the Docker Compose file, what you're going to see here is the fact that we've described three services. We have a database service, which is going to be an individual container. We have PGAdmin, which is going to be the admin interface, so we can administrate our database. That's going to be in a separate container. And we have our app, our FastAPI app. So what we're going to do here is we're going to essentially just run this file. It's going to download the images that we're going to need to run this. So essentially what an image is, for example, a whole working version of PostgreSQL database, this image. So this image is going to be downloaded from the official Docker Hub repository. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this image to build a container. So essentially this container, the container that we run is going to be built from this image. And what we're doing here is we're going to pass in some other parameters into our image, into our container, so that we can set up the environment slightly differently. Now, if you go over to Docker Hub, if you're not familiar with this, you can have a look at all these different parameters you can set up. And I will move through these step by step when we go through the tutorial. But essentially that's what we're going to do now. We're going to start this up. So here in the tutorial file is all the code that we're going to need for this tutorial. Sorry, the commands that we're going to need. So all we need to do here is, first of all, we're going to build. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that we're going to inspect the Docker file. It's going to download and install the Python image so we can run our application within a container that is running an operating system essentially with Python pre-installed. So we've got this going, and we've got some environment variables here that we need to set up. So it looks like that's been done now. So if I go back to my Docker desktop, you can see that's exactly what's just happened here. So this is an image with, it's going to have Linux installed. It's going to have everything that Python needs to run Python. And in addition to that, it now has, because I've copied across all of these files here, I've run through pip to install the requirements needed to run our application. And everything is now being installed and ready on that image. So I can turn that into a container and run it. Right, so that's that done. So now what I can do is just set everything else up here. So you can see the second command here is Docker Compose up. Now I could have run this to begin with. I just wanted to go through that step to show you. So Docker Compose up. What's going to happen now is that this file here is going to be inspected. You can see we're downloading something here. That's the image for Postgres and PGAdmin. So those are going to be downloaded, those images. It's then going to configure the settings on those images, and we're going to then start the container. And that pretty much is the end game for this. So we'll wait a couple of seconds for that. You can now see we're downloading the PGAdmin image. So once that's done, you're going to then see that appear in your images. So this is Postgres here. A couple of seconds, we'll see the PGAdmin. Once that's done, Docker is then going to try and start all of these. And you can see now it says in use. So if I go to my containers here, you can see I've got a cluster of containers, 3 services, and they're all running. It's all green. So if you've got to this point, we pretty much know that this is going to work for you, this tutorial. So let's go ahead now. I'll just take you through accessing PGAdmin, and we can see what's happening. And I'll give you a preview if you want to. You can skip now if you like, but I'll give you a quick preview of what it is we're going to be developing. So first up then, let's go ahead and just access the service. So you can see the root directory here has an endpoint, just sends back a message. So this is the data we've received from our API, just says message hello world, with just a dictionary here. So let's go ahead now and access the PGAdmin. So it's 5050, this is the port we're using. I'll explain all this when we get there. Now the username and password for this is admin@admin.com, and the password is admin. Now you can set this up when we go through the tutorial. That will be changeable. So if you go into the environment variables here, you can see all these settings that have been applied. Right, so going back here, going to login, that logs us in. Now what we need to do here is select servers, go to objects, create, and server. We need to connect PGAdmin to our server or to our database server. So we're going to call this DB, the connection. Now we need to know the host name or the address. Now we're using Docker here, so what we can do is use the Docker name DB. That's the service name. And then we can then go ahead and have the username and password, which is password. Again, this is all described and this is all configurable within our file here, environment file here. So our user database is Postgres. Our password is password. So that's that set up. Press save. You can now see I have access to my database. Right, so this is my database. It's set up the book database ready for our API. And if I go into schemas, you're going to find your tables. And you can see that we don't have any tables at the minute. So we'll go ahead in a second and build some tables. All right, so let's go back to our API. Now we do have a package which enables us to interact with our API. So if we go to the docs URL here, you can see that we have 4 entry points, if you like, or 4 API endpoints where we can send or get data. So here is the default endpoint here, root. So we've seen that already. So if I just go to there, you can see we return a simple piece of data here. So that's just an example that we go through to understand what is happening here with FastAPI and how to build an endpoint. Right, so you can see also we have an endpoint here to show all the books in our database and add an author and add some books. Now, before we add any data, we're going to need some tables in our database. So this is where some other technologies that we're utilizing here come into play. So let's go back to our implementation here. I'm going to open up a new command prompt. And what we're going to need to do here, if we go into the tutorial, what we're going to need to do is create a migration. So if you're coming from Django or Flask, you probably already are familiar with the idea of making data migrations and then migrating that to the database. So the whole point here, if you're not familiar, is that we build tables utilizing Python classes. So Python classes cannot be inserted into the database. So we need some way of converting that into SQL. So essentially that's what SQLAlchemy is going to help us with, convert this into a file which is then going to be prepared and then converted to SQL so it can then be sent to the database so we can create our tables or update or administrate our tables. So what we're going to do here is, first of all, we're going to make a migration file in preparation to actually prepare the data to be sent to the database so we can create the table. So if you look here in Alembic versions, you can see we've created a migration and what's going to happen. Okay, so no need to read that for now, but that's essentially what's happening, just taking you through that process. So now what we need to do, go back to this tutorial file, we need to actually then apply this migration. So this is what we're doing here. So we're running a command inside the app container. That's what we're doing. We're passing this command over to that container and we're running this command. So Alembic is going to help us manage the migrations and actually then kind of process or help process creating that SQL so it can be sent across to the Postgres database and we can then actually build our tables in this case. So that's that done there. So let's just go back into our PGAdmin and we're just going to refresh our tables. And you can now see we've got 2 additional tables, author and book. Right, so let's go back to our docs here. So now what we can do is create a new book. So at this point, there is a dependency here, referential dependency, a foreign key between the book and the author. So there has to be an author before we can create a book. So let's just try this out. We'll just go for the default. We can change this if we want to. We'll just go for the default here. Execute. So we've now created a new author. Right, so we get a response, a 200 response. So we're good to go. That's all worked okay. Right, so now we have an author. We can now make a book. So we're using post again here to send data to our API. So it then creates data or saves the data to our database. So we need to change the author to 1. So let's try this out. So we want to make a new piece of data here. The title can just be whatever, book 1, rating 10, and then author ID 1. Now, because we've already made an author, there's an auto incremented ID in the table. And we're going to use ID number 1, which is reference to that first author that we created. If we use 2, for example, or 12, you can see that we get a 500 response because there isn't a user with an ID of 12. There's a user of ID of 1. So if we execute, we now have a response of 200. Everything is working okay. Let's go back. Let's have a look at our table so we can see the data here. So we've got our new book. And if we look and inspect our author, you can now see also we have our first author. So here we're going to set up an endpoint to see all the books. So let's just go ahead and do that. There we go. So that returns all the data from our API about the books we have in our database. So hopefully at this point, you've managed to follow the steps and you've now got a working copy from the repository code. So welcome to part 2 of this tutorial. In this part, we're going to start the project now. First of all, we're going to build the necessary files and code so that we can get PostgreSQL started in Docker, as well as PGAdmin so we can start to administrate our database. So I'm using Visual Studio Code again. So go ahead, file, open a folder, create a new project folder. Here we are in a new folder. So first of all, we're going to build our virtual environment. You can see that I'm already in a virtual environment here. So I just need to close that up a second. See if I can get out of that. Yep, there we go. Right, so the first thing we're going to need to do in our project is we're going to build everything within a virtual environment. So we can do this first. We may as well. So let's go ahead now and do exactly that. So here in Windows, if you didn't see the first section, I did go through that process. So let's just go through and create a new virtual environment. If you're not too sure what this is, if you skip the first section, just have a quick look online. We're building a virtual environment. We're going to build our application within this virtual environment. Now, we're not going to necessarily need it for this step, but I just wanted to get it started so we can start building our application. Right, so once you've gone ahead, you can see that we now have what is all the code that we need to activate our virtual environment. So let's go ahead and do that. So this just allows us to work within a virtual environment. Our project will then work within this environment. So we can set this environment however we like for this specific project. That's the idea. So you can see I now activated the virtual environment. It's indicated here at the start of the command line here. Right, so now we've got that in place. Like I said, we don't necessarily need it for this step. I just wanted to go through that process right here. So let's go ahead now and set up PostgreSQL and our PGAdmin. So the first thing we're going to need to do here then is we're going to create a new file. This is going to be a Docker Compose file. If you haven't used Docker before, Docker allows us to create containers, which we can then run applications. So it does save us, for example, having to install PostgreSQL onto our machine. It means that we can install this in a container, which is kind of container. This is a container that's separate, if you like, from our operating system. So it allows us to be almost OS independent. So whether you're running Linux or Mac, this is going to run, as long as you can run Docker on your operating system, we can run a container which has its individual operating system and all the softwares that we're going to need to run whatever we want in that container. So let's go ahead now and build up this. So first of all, we need to select the version of code, if you like, that we're going to utilize in this file. So the latest being 3.8. So let's go ahead and now set out some services. Right, so services really are identifying what it is we want to run. Now we're going to create, as you probably saw in the preview, we've created 3 containers, one for our database, one for the admin, PGAdmin, and then one for our actual application. So we're going to first of all set out our database here. So we're just going to give this a name of database. Now, I always like to name my containers. So I've just given this container name PostgreSQL DB. So next up, we're going to define the image. So again, if you're new to Docker, how this works is that we build an image. That image is converted, if you like, into a container, or it allows you to run the container. So think Windows installation disk or USB. In order for us to run Windows, we take that image of Windows, we take that CD or USB of Windows, we install it. So it's kind of like the same thing here. We take the image and we make it into a running container, which we can then run. So this image normally includes an operating system of some sort. And this particular image here with a Postgres image, this is going to be downloaded from Docker Hub. So again, if you're not familiar with Docker Hub, basically that's a repository where you can build your own images if you like. So take, for example, if you wanted to build an image of this project, you could do that. You could put it on Docker Hub and other people could download it and use it, for example. So this is the same thing. So this is an official image from Postgres database, the maintainer of Postgres database. So this is going to download an image which has an operating system and the database already kind of pre-installed. And what we can do is add additional parameters to this image so we can override some of the settings, for example, the username and password. So I'm going to set this to restart always, because if the container fails or it closes down by accident or something happens, it's going to try and activate the container again. And it's pretty important that our database is working, else the service isn't going to work at all. So now what we're going to do here is add some ports. So imagine this is a container. The only way inside of that container is through ports, for example. So if we want to send data to the container, we need to open a port, a channel into the database. So if you're not familiar with ports, think of it as a doorway, a doorway into this container so we can access this service. And this service inside this container is looking for this port, or looking for this port to be active, or someone to send data, for example, to activate this port. So what's happening here is we're mapping this port number inside of our container to this port number, which is on our local machine, say, for example. So when we send data to this port on our local machine, it's going to forward it to this container on this port, and then this service is going to then pick up that data, for example. So that's what's happening there. Now we can set up some environment variables. So if you go to the Postgres image on Docker Hub, you'll read through and it'll provide you all the details you need about all the different settings you can configure initially. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to set up the username and then the password, and then also the database that I want to initially set up, if you like, when I actually create this database container or database image. So that's going to be all generated from an environment file. So what I'm going to do now is going to create an environment file. So what this is here, if you're not familiar with this, is that you don't want to. Now imagine this code here is going to be pushed to GitHub. You may be working in a team, for example. Now you don't want everyone necessarily to know the username and passwords for all of your applications. So the idea here, at least, is this environment file here, which will not be actually included in the GitHub repository. This is going to host all the critical sensitive data. And the idea here is that when we build an image, when we run a container, Docker is going to look for this file for all of this data here. So we're going to essentially just set up variables, if you like, that's going to be passed in through this environment file. Now, in a production environment, you're going to pass these details onto your server. And the whole point here is that no one is able to necessarily access those details. It's hidden behind the scenes on your server, and it can only be accessed via your application, for example. So it's just a way of kind of hiding your details. And we'll go through two approaches here because we are just working in a development environment. So there's just an extra thing we need to do a bit later. Okay, so let's go ahead now and just set these up here. So what we're going to need to set up is the DB user password and name. So those are the names here that we passed in. So DB password, user and name. So we're just going to set this up. So Postgres, that's the default user in actual fact for a Postgres image here. So we're going to stick with that. So you probably won't need to change that for now. We won't be able to. This password you can change to whatever you like, and the name of the database you can also change to whatever you like too. Right. So now that's configured there. We can now move on and create our second service, which is PGAdmin. So this is just one of many. This is a web-based interface that allows us to connect to our database and administrate our database through kind of a graphical user interface. So we're going to give this container a name. You can see that we're going to use this image here. Again, Docker Hub, have a look for this image. You'll get all the details about this image. And then we set some environments like before. So we're going to set the default username and password. And then we define the ports. So what we're doing here is we're mapping port 5050 on our local machine to port 80 on this container. So anytime we kind of go into this, anytime we go to our browser, we type in this port, that's going to be mapped across to port 80 on this container. Now, port 80, remember, is the internet or HTTP port, default port. And remember, this is a web-based interface, so it's going to need port 80 to access it. So it's just a way of us kind of translating over, accessing this service inside of this container, which is running on port 80. And this is just, we can change that to whatever you like. So we're just going to use 5050 for now. Right, so with that in place, the only last thing to do is just to define depends on. So this is just a way of almost identifying the order in which to bring up the containers, because there's no point bringing up this container here if a database doesn't exist. So when we build this environment, it makes sense for our database to be developed first and started, and then bring up the PGAdmin, which is dependent upon the database. So it depends on the database being live. So that just allows us to kind of almost order how this setup is configured and initially started in Docker. Right, so with that in place, that's pretty much all we need to do here. So the next thing, if you look in the tutorial file, which I'm just going to bring in now, all the code here, or all the commands here, is in this file. So from here, what we're going to do is just use Docker compose up. Okay, so that's essentially going to be a command that's going to tell Docker to look at this file. We're going to download these images from the repositories. We're going to kind of configure these environment variables, and we're then going to run a container. So by the end of this command here, it will take a couple of seconds to do this because we need to download all these images. We have two containers running, one called PGAdmin, one called PostgreSQL. So let's give this a go. Right, so you can see what's happening here. There's a few things being downloaded. Now, I've already downloaded because I've gone through the initial steps at the start. So I already had the images ready. So let me just remove this. I'll do this again just so you can see now. You may be starting from scratch. Just going to remove this if it lets me. So there's two ways to kind of remove these containers here. I can do them individually or just utilize this setting here. So just the way I'm doing this, just remove those. I'll just go ahead again just to show you. Apologies, just waiting a little bit of time. So let me just run the command again. So you can see now what's happening is it's pulling the Postgres database from the Docker Hub. Yeah, so it's downloading that. So that's going to take a couple of seconds. Eventually, the image will appear here, and then the second image will then be downloaded, PGAdmin, and then it goes through the process of setting those environment variables, and then the containers will start. Okay, everything is downloaded. You can now see it says in use, because what's happened now is we've created a container, or Docker's created a container with these two services. Now notice that one of these is exited, which suggests there is a problem in our configuration. So let's just go ahead and have a look. So if we look at the log here, it takes you through like the process of everything being developed and started. So PGAdmin exited with code 1. So I'm not entirely sure why that is. Database system is shut down. So it's well worth, if you need to troubleshoot, just having a look through here. I don't think there's anything obvious. But if you read through, you will find the actual result here. So I've missed a step. So I did this on purpose. I promise I did this on purpose, just to show you what to kind of look for if there's a problem. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing I can, and the most valuable thing I can show you, is how to troubleshoot. Anyone can follow a guide and get it working straight away potentially, but it's when you have problems, that's when it takes a long time. So clearly here at the start, in the first instance, it tells me that you need to define the PGAdmin email and default password. Okay, so like we did with the database, we need to set up these two in our environment file here. So just bring those in, set something up. There we go. So we've got an email and password. So now what we can do is just close everything down. Now we can do this through the command line, or we can control it here. You can see we've got stop, we've got restart, delete, etc. So let's just go ahead and just delete this container here. And what I can now do is go back and I'll just close everything down. Okay, let's just start again. So compose up. So what's going to happen now is you can see that we're going to start the existing Postgres database. You can see we've created a new container with PGAdmin. Everything is now green, which now just indicates that everything is working okay. Right, so now we've got that in place. Everything is working okay. Let's go back into our PGAdmin. So remember, we're going to use 127.0.0.1.50.50. That's the ports that we've set up. And we've just set up the username and password. That was in the environment file. Okay, because we need to refresh, there was a problem there. That's not a problem. Okay, so there we go. So that takes us into PGAdmin. And now we can just select servers, object create server. And don't forget to select servers, otherwise that option doesn't come up. So let's just give this a name for this connection. Now our host name here is going to be the name of the container, or our service, our database service, which if we look back into our file, we named it DB. So here, for example, our service we named DB. So instead of having to worry about IP addresses, etc., we can just type in the name here of our service, which is handy. So we've got the username. So here is just all set up for us. The password is going to be password. That's what we've set up in our environment file, our env file. Press save. That's going to then connect to our database. You can now see we can access our database, and one of them being book_db, which we set up initially in our configuration here. So just going back here, you can see that we kind of created a Postgres database when we set this up called book_db. Right, so that's pretty much it for the setup here. What we need to do now is create some tables so that we can populate our database with some tables. And then we need to work out how to use our API to access data and then obviously save data to our database. So that concludes part 2, Docker, PostgreSQL and PGAdmin setup. Hopefully I've given you enough information if you are completely new to Docker. It gives you a general idea of how that is working. And to be honest, it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And remember, this is really useful. Hopefully you've already seen the benefit here of not having to install Postgres on your machine and worry about all of that. And because we've got an image, because we're using an image here, we can see how adaptable that is. So everyone can just use the same image. So you go from machine to machine, or you pass this over to another developer. They just need to spin up a Docker image of Postgres and use the same settings that you're using. And there we go. Everything, the environment is exactly the same. Of course, there are a few things here to point out. If you're wondering, if you are completely new to Docker, it's worth noting this, that anything that's saved here in this container at the moment isn't going to be saved. So as soon as I delete this container, everything inside of here will disappear. So if I add some data to my database, or if I add any settings like we did here with PGAdmin, we set up the server connection, that's going to be deleted if I remove this. Now, if you want to know more about that, I do have some tutorials where we look at persisting the data But if you go over to Docker, or if you just type in, for example, how to persist data or how to save data in Docker containers, there's loads of information on how to do that. I'm not going to show you in this tutorial, I just want to get things started. But that's something you can definitely do. And it's something to, for me to note if you are new to Docker. Right, so part 3 then. So we now have Docker PostgreSQL PGAdmin set up. So now we need to move over to our API. So in the previous tutorial, we already set up, pre-configured the virtual environment. So I just close this container setup down. We don't need this for now. Okay, so Control C, that just closes all the containers. Right, so yeah, we've already gone ahead and created a virtual environment in the last section. Just head over to that section if you don't know how to do that and you have skipped across to this section. Right, so I'm now working within my virtual environment. Remember how that was done? I activated the virtual environment. So now we can go ahead and start to build our API. So let's start by building a new file called main. And here we're going to just go through the setup with FastAPI. So we have a file here. Now, in order for us to actually run our application, we're going to need some sort of web server. So the web server of choice here is going to be Uvicorn. So this is an ASGI server. This is going to allow us to send data, or send requests, sorry, to our server essentially, and this is then going to point it to FastAPI. It just acts as a way of us being able to actually send HTTP requests. It manages the requests for us, as well as some other important features to allow us to actually run our API with FastAPI. So if you needed more information, that's pretty much all you need to know at this point. We're going to need this in order for us to actually utilize FastAPI, for us to actually manage the requests. So have a look at that if you're not familiar with Uvicorn. Right, so this is something that we need to bring into our project. So let's go ahead and start to build this up. So this is going to be an import. So let's import this in. Now this doesn't exist at the moment, but we're also going to need FastAPI. Right, so let's go ahead and just import FastAPI too. And from here, we're going to now think about actually building or importing these libraries or packages into our application. So we're going to need to pip install. Now, again, if you go into the tutorial, I've got a big list of everything that we're going to need here. So we'll just do this individually. So FastAPI. So we'll just install FastAPI first, and then we go ahead and just install Uvicorn. Okay, so that's that sorted. So we now have potential for us to actually start our API service and for it to be able to manage the actual requests that are coming into our server and passing them over to FastAPI. Right, so with that done, let's now just move across and think about building a simple kind of API endpoint. So here we're going to use this declarator here, app-get. Now this is from this is from FastAPI. So what we're going to need to do here is actually reference app from FastAPI. So app equals FastAPI. So essentially what we're doing here is we're bringing in FastAPI, all the tools that we're going to need. We're kind of referencing that as this function here, sorry, as this variable, bringing this in, and then we're going to use this tool within FastAPI to actually then do something. In this case, it's a GET request. So here, this is referring to a GET request. Now we can, like if you're familiar with Django, we can work here with classes or we can work here with functions. So this is a function-based approach here, if you like. Now this setup does support async requests. That's something that we can potentially move into another tutorial, but we're just going to set this up like this here. So this is going to be the endpoint, so just the root directory of our application. If we send a GET request to that, basically what we're returning is this here, just a simple message, hello world. Right, so that's a kind of an endpoint for this system. So let's go about actually now kind of building this so that we can test this out. Right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to build a new file here. This is going to be a Docker file. Okay, so whereas before we built a Docker Compose file, that allowed us to build in these other services here. So now we're going to build a new service. Now we're going to use a Docker file here, which is going to set up this or build a new image for us. So what we want to do is we want to build from an existing image, so a Python 3 image. So this is going to be a kind of a Linux image, which has Python installed. Now there are obviously other slimmer versions of this. So if you are new to Docker, you'll see that going through the documentation, there are loads of different versions of Python that we can utilize. Operating system, Linux-based operating systems. This is fairly heavy version. I just didn't want to go through the different aspects that are needed to get this working with the slim version. So we're just going to use the full version for this. And then we're just going to make sure that everything is nicely accessible and is sent directly to the terminal. So we're going to use the Python unbuffered equals 1. Now what we're going to need to do here is we're going to set up a working directory. So what we're doing here is we're getting the image that we want to use. We're now setting some environment variables, if you like. And what we're going to now do is create a new create a new folder on our image called app. So that's where our application is going to be held. So imagine we're now building our image. That's going to have an operating system. On the operating system as a file system, we're now going to build a new folder for our application. So we do that first. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install some dependencies. So let's do a pip freeze. And then we're going to build a new requirements file. If you're not familiar with this, you won't know that what's happening here essentially is we're just basically taking all the packages that we've just installed. And then we're going to make a nice list of those so that they can be replicated in our container. So we're going to install all of these essentially on our image, so it's then available in our container. Right, so what we need to do now is we need to copy this file over to our image, to our container, if you like. So we do that, copy requirements text. We copy that over to copy that over as requirements.txt. So that's copied over. So now we've copied that over, let's go ahead now and run some more commands. So we're going to basically just upgrade pip, or just make sure we're using the latest version of pip. And then what we're going to do is we're then going to run the pip install run command. So we're going to install everything that's in that requirements file. Remember, that's been copied across over to our container. Essentially, now we're going to run those commands, our image. So now we have an image that has Python installed. It has all of our files, all of our requirements set up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to copy this folder here across. Now this will hold obviously all of our data, application data. So essentially we're just copying this all across. We can obviously specify what we don't want to copy across, but now we're just going to copy everything across. So that's going to go across over to our image. And then we want to expose port 8000 because that's how we're going to access this, our application, our API. So we expose the 8000 port. So that basically is all the commands that we're going to need to set up and build our image so we can then run that image as a container, and that will be our application. So what we need to do now is run the second command here, build. So build is basically going to look at this file here. It's going to download the Python image. It's going to set all these here. So we're going to copy this across to our image. We're going to install everything. So we're going to see that happening through the terminal here. If I just move this up. DB uses an image, skip in PGAdmin, use an image, skip it. Okay, so what's coming here? Docker compose build. Oh, sorry. I think I've, no, we're good. Okay. So apologies. I haven't finished this off. So we've got this all in place. So what's happening here, we're using Docker compose. Apologies, I had a moment there. So what we're going to need to do now is just go into Docker Compose, and we just basically need to hook up our Docker file so we know what's going on. So let's build a new service here. So this is going to be our app service. So let's go ahead and build this. So we're going to call this app. Yeah, this is our third service here. So I'm going to call the container app, and then I'm going to build. So what do we want to build? Well, we want to build. So basically this build command here is saying, where's the build information? So that's a Docker file. So using dot means, or this directory. So it's going to find the Docker file this way, right? So we are going to run a command when we actually then get everything started. So that's going to be basically just running the Uvicorn server. So we're going to run the Uvicorn server. We're setting up the host and the port. That's essentially what we're doing here. Now I'll explain what this Alembic command is doing later. But essentially what we're doing here is we're just starting the server. So when we build the container, we're going to start the server and we're just defining the parameters here where the server runs and the port number. That's essentially what's going to happen here, right? So with that done, let's go over to the volumes. So what we're doing now here is, remember we created this folder here on our server. So what we're going to do is basically just copy everything over here, or just make sure that everything here is copied over to this app and vice versa, right? So this volumes allows us, if we add anything to our server, it's also going to be added to this directory too, if it's any changes are made in this app folder. That's the idea. Okay, so we're creating the volumes. We're just mirroring across our container to our development folder here. So we've got some ports. So we're just mapping over the port 8000 from our machine to this container. And then this depends on the database again. So we want to start the container, the database container first before we start building the app. And we can also have restart always, because if there is a problem with the container, we do want to restart this because it's obviously very important for our actual system to be running, or our service to run. Right, so those are the commands that we're going to need. So now when I run docker compose build, what's going to happen now is what I said previously. It's now going to be looking through a Docker file. You can see what's happening here. We're actually installing all the requirements. You can see the commands being run that we have in our Docker file. So that would hopefully run successfully. Yep. And now what we have is a new image. So when we go back here to our images, we now have this new image here. It's quite large because we aren't using the slim version of Postgres. So with that in place, we're now ready to potentially run this. So we already have our two containers there already, but let's go ahead now and just run compose up, and that will pick up our new service, of course. Okay, so the app's running. So there's a few issues here. So you can see here it says bash Alembic command not found. Okay, so I've kind of just gone ahead really here. So let's just go ahead and just remove this command here from our compose file because we haven't got it installed. So it's just another oversight for me. So apologies. So let me just Control C that. Let's just go ahead again. Let's just do this again. So I'm just going to remove this container. Let's go ahead and just delete this image. Let's just start this again. So this time we've just removed Alembic, so we don't need to utilize that for now. We'll install that later. So let's just get this started. So compose up again. So we're building our image again. This time you can see that there's missing one requirement positional argument, path in get. So okay, so there looks like there's an issue here maybe, but the path is set, so I'm not entirely sure what's happening there. So let's go ahead now and let's go into our application. So this is just from previous applications. Let's go ahead and run, see if this is working. So you can see it's not working. There seems to be a problem. Okay, I do apologize. It's just an error in the code here. I noticed that we need the parentheses there. So I think that will fix our problem. It looks like straight away, we don't need to stop or close anything down here. Looks like everything is okay. Now remember that this code here, we are mirroring this code, and it does help us kind of establish this point because we are creating, in the doc compose, we are running this volume here. So we're mirroring. Anytime we make changes here, it's going to mirror that across to our container. Okay, so that does mean that small change I made there, you can see it was instant. It now brings up the service correctly. So that's important to understand. So we can work within the container. That's essentially what's happening here, isn't it? We're working locally here in our development machine, but we're also working in the container. So let's go ahead now and refresh, and you can see now we received the message. And essentially what we've done now is we have a web server running, our Uvicorn server, that's allowing us to host our FastAPI API. You can see that we sent a request to our API that's been handled by our server, passed across to FastAPI. We've returned this data. So now obviously we want to get data from our database and then send that back, rather than kind of hard code information and return that from our API. So let's now think about building a database and setting up all the database aspects here so that we can return and save data to our database. So first up then, let's build a new file here. We're going to call this models.py. Okay, so if you're familiar to Django or utilizing Flask, you've probably used an ORM before. Here we're going to be utilizing SQLAlchemy. So again, if you're coming from Flask, this is going to make perfect sense. So here we're going to build a new model. So essentially we're going to describe our tables that we want to build in our database. And we're going to do that utilizing classes, Python classes. So what happens here is that by utilizing tools such as SQLAlchemy, that's going to help us actually take our class and convert that into SQL code so it can then be inserted and communicated to the database. So here we're going to describe two classes, which is going to be our two tables that we're going to build. So we're going to build a book table. And in addition to that, we're going to build our author table. So let me just build up like this first, and then we'll go through this step by step. So what's going to happen here is that in order for us to build these tables, we need to describe what fields we want in our table. So book and author is going to be the name of our table, although we're going to describe that slightly different in a minute. So this is what we're doing here. We're building these classes here, then we're going to build some fields. So similar to what we do in Django, for example, we're going to need to bring in some tools that we can actually then describe our table and then allow SQLAlchemy to actually then be able to convert that for us. So ultimately, using SQLAlchemy means that we don't need to learn anything about SQL code. We can just use our normal Python code classes to build tables. So before we go ahead and do that, let's go ahead and just Control-C this, just close all of our containers down. So that'll take a couple of seconds. And what we're going to need to do now is just allow FastAPI to be able to communicate with SQLAlchemy. And then in addition to that, we're going to also need to actually utilize SQLAlchemy. So let's go ahead and pip install. Okay, so that's going to take a couple of seconds. So with that installed, let's go back to our models and let's just finish off our models. So it's well worth at this point, if you haven't used SQLAlchemy before, just to go through maybe a basic tutorial of SQLAlchemy. I'll give you a general pointer as to what we're doing here. So in order for us to actually build our model, we need to be able to describe what it is that we're doing, what tools we want to utilize to actually build our table. So integers, date, time, foreign keys, strings. So we need to define our data, our fields. So from SQLAlchemy, we're going to import columns so we can build new columns, date time so we can create a date time field, foreign keys because we want to make a table which has a foreign key, a many to one connection, integers because we want to have data in our fields that are integers, and strings because we want to build some fields that have strings or a string type of data. So here we're going to bring in our declarative base. So here essentially this just allows us to actually describe our fields, if you like. So we're going to need to bring this in. Relationships, because we want to build a foreign key relationship. Let's bring in relationship from SQLAlchemy.orm. And we're going to bring in funct as well. This is just going to allow us to build our time date, so update time and time update. So we'll move across. So we just take base from our declarative base here. So we're going to bring in base into each of our classes. That's going to then allow us to then essentially describe our tables. So let's get going. So first of all, book. So we bring in base, and now we can kind of expand from here. So we're going to give us a table name. That's going to be book. That's the first thing. So although we defined here in book, so in Django, we know that, for example, we just need to define a name here. So here we explicitly define the table name as book. Then we go ahead. Now we're going to create an ID. So this is going to be an auto incrementing primary key, index true, and it's going to be an integer. So we define column in addition. Okay, so you can see some of the tools that we're starting to bring here in that we've imported in. Right, so now we're going to have a title. So this is a book. So book title. It's going to be a new column. It's going to be a string. So if you're looking to define some more parameters here, we can most definitely. I'm just going through a basic setup here. Again, if you're familiar with Django or Flask, using Flask, you'll know that potentially we can now expand this, maybe define the amount, the limits, and so on. So go ahead and have a look at the documentation for more information there. So I'm just going to go for rating and time created here. So I'm going to make a new column, date time, and then I'm going to go ahead and just grab the data to set the date time for this date time field. And then normally you might have a time updated. So anytime you update the data, we're going to get the timestamp for that particular time where it's been updated, so we can save that too. So those are probably two typical fields that you're going to be utilizing in many of your tables. So I've just thought I'll bring that in. Right, so now I'm going to build a many-to-one. So for many books, there might be one author. So it's going to have a many-to-one foreign key. So this is how I'm going to set this up. Author ID, that's the field name. So it's expecting an integer. And here I'm going to define a foreign key to author.id. So I'm going to make a new table now, once I've defined author relationship. So what's happening here is I said author ID. At the moment, we don't know what author is. So we've defined the relationship here as capital author, and that's going to be the name of the class that we're now going to build. So that's going to build our foreign key from this table to the next. So here you can see this is all now matching up, author here, and now we know a little bit more about the author ID, because now we're going to set out the name and the ID. So essentially we're just matching this field here to the ID here of this author field. You can see this is going to be a primary key, an integer. So let's go ahead and add the name, age, whatever you want at this point, time updated, and there we go. Right, so that pretty much finishes off the tables and the fields that we're going to create for this system. So hopefully that's given you enough information to now think about jumping into the documents, and you can now kind of expand that with other fields. Okay, so now we've done that. Now let's move across back to our main file. Actually, before we move on and create a new endpoint, let's just go ahead and think about, well, how do I actually get this data from my model into my database? So this is where we're going to bring a new tool. So let's just go into our tutorial here. So this is where we're going to bring in Alembic. So this tool here essentially is going to work with SQLAlchemy to allow us to make migrations and migrate. So again, if you come from a Django DRF background, that makes sense. We needed to migrate our database. So what we're going to do by making a migration, we're essentially taking our models here and it's going to get converted into a file, which we can then migrate, run another command, migrate essentially, which is then going to actually then apply the migrations to our database. So that's how we're going to get these tables into our database. We're going to use Alembic here for that. So let's go ahead and just open up the terminal. Open up the terminal, and you can drag that up and press Control and comma. So from here, let's just do a pip install. Okay, so we are going to be working with a Postgres database, so we're going to need the tools for that. So let's also bring in this pip install. Okay, so with that in place, let's now go ahead and activate Alembic here. So to do that, what we're going to need to do here is just run the command. So let's do Alembic. And we're going to initialize this as the folder Alembic. Okay, so notice when I run this command here, essentially this is going to set up all the configuration files here so that we can then manage our migration. So what you're seeing here is versions. So again, I hate keep saying this, apologies. If you're coming from like a Django background again, you get the idea here. What's going to be in this folder is any migrations that we've created. So that's going to almost keep a record of all the migrations. So that's going to help us perform these type of actions. So with that set up, there's a few more things that we need to do here. So let's just go into the INI file. So we've got the environment file. Apologies. So apologies, we've got the INI file here. So let's just remove all this stuff here. So you can go ahead and read this. I'm just going to slim this down. So as I go through this, we'll just add and we'll take away some things in a second. So we're just going to need to make a few changes here. Now we're going to describe our URL address in the environment file. So we can remove this for now. So this is just the connection to the SQLAlchemy URL. So we know how to kind of connect to our database. So I'm just going to remove that for now. We don't need that. So let's just get rid of all this other configuration. Okay, so that slims it down nicely. Just remove that. So let's now bring in essentially how we're going to connect to our database. So we need a connection string. So we know how to actually connect to our database from our application. So that's going to be hosted here in the environment file. So let's just add this in. There we go. So what we're doing here is we are essentially building a link to our database. So the PostgreSQL, utilizing the tools that we've installed in order to actually do that. So here we've got the name of the user. We've got the password. So I've just set that to the word password. So that's my password. And then the database is hosted on port 5432. So if we go into our Docker file here, you can see that 5432 is where it's hosted. And here then slash, and then the actual table we want to work on. So this is, like I said, going to be utilized for us to actually build and make a connection to our database. Okay, so in order for us to actually utilize this environment file in our system in development here, we're going to need to install a package that's going to allow us to do that. So let's just pip install python.env. Right, so it's going to be clear in a second why we're doing this, but essentially what we want to do is we don't want to hard code this into our program. We want to use it in our env file. Now, because we're utilizing this on kind of in our development environment here, we just need to install this package, and that's going to allow us then to actually access this file so we can access this environment variable. Okay, so I've closed down. So now let's set up the environment folder here in Alembic. So what we're going to need to do here is make access or allow access to our env file so we can access our database URL. We're going to need to do that. So let's go ahead and set this up. So above here, I'm just going to paste some code in here. So we're going to import OS and sys. We're going to import from.env, import load.env. So essentially here, we're just trying to essentially make access to our environment folder so we can then bring this into our project. So what we're going to need to do here is underneath maybe the context here, let's just go ahead now and set make a connection. So config.set main options, SQLAlchemy URL, and that's going to be what we set now in our env file. Okay, so now we've kind of set that up. Let's go ahead and import our models. So we're going to need to import our models so we can have access to our models, of course. So just down here, let's just import models. So that's going to be our models here. Now, what we want to do then is set the target. So at the moment, we've got target metadata none. So we want to basically set the target to the models. So let's just let's do that. So we've imported our models. target metadata models.base.metadata. That's going to point to our models. So essentially what we've done here is we've created a connection to our database. So we now know when we migrate our models, we know where we're going to send them. That's where the database is. And that's obviously being configured from here. So that's our configuration. So once we've done that, we're then saying, well, what models, where are our models that we need to migrate? So we're just defining that here, import models, target metadata models. That's a file. Inside of here, we've got our base models, if you like. And then obviously the metadata will be all the fields. Right, so with that set up, what we can probably do now is, well, we've created the models. So what we can probably do now is run our first migration. So let's go ahead and just make sure our containers are up. Okay, so let's bring that up. Docker Compose up. So that should bring up all of our applications. So I'm just going to open up a new command prompt here. So now if you go into the tutorial, we've got two commands. The first command here is going to send a command to our app container using Alembic. Remember, this is being copied across to our container. We're mirroring this across. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new migration. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll send this command across to that container. So hopefully if we haven't got a problem, and it looks like we do have a problem here. So we were expecting a problem here. And let me just explain what's going on here. We've got a bit comfortable understanding that, we change our files here, potentially it updates our container. But let's remember the container is built from an image. That image, remember when we installed the image or created the image initially, it installed everything from the requirements file. Now remember, we've gone ahead and now we've installed some more libraries. And of course, that isn't going to be in our requirements file. So what we need to do now is go ahead and pip freeze again and just update our requirements file, which now includes some of the other libraries packages that we've installed, one of them being Alembic here. And we also installed the needed library to actually be able to communicate with Postgres database. So you can see it also install some other packages that we'll talk about, libraries that we'll talk about shortly. Right, so now we've updated that. Let's go ahead. I've closed the containers. I'm just going to delete these. So I can do them individually like this, or I can just do them as a whole, utilizing that. So images here, let's just get rid of this image, remove that image. So let's just run Docker Compose up again. Now we've updated a requirements file. So let's give this a go. So that's going to build our new image. So that should take a couple of seconds to do. Once it's built, obviously it's going to activate, or it's going to create all the containers. Okay, so everything's now in use. So the container's working okay. Looks like it's running okay. So let's now go ahead and open up our CMD here again. Right, so now let's go back into our commands here. So now let's give this a go again. This is going to be our Docker Compose. So now what we're going to do now is try and make a migration. Okay, so it looks like everything is okay. So as soon as we've made a migration, if we look in the versions here, you'll notice that we've got a new migration file. So it's got a revision. So that allows us to identify this particular migration change in the database. You can see we're creating an upgrade here. And this is all the columns that we're going to create for our table. So there's downgrades, there's upgrades. Yeah, this is basically all the changes that we're going to perform. This is going to get converted into SQL, and the actions are then going to be performed. So what we can now do is go ahead and run this Alembic command here, upgrade head, and that's going to take the migration and actually then migrate it to the database. Now we've already set up in the env file here. Remember, we brought in, we've set up all of our database connectivity here. So let's go ahead and run this. So that now this should actually make the migration. Okay, so it looks like it's worked okay. So now let's go into PGAdmin. Let's just go ahead and refresh. So I'm going to refresh or reload PGAdmin. Let me just log in again. Because we started the container again, it just means we need to log in again. And in addition to that, we're going to need to, because the data isn't persistent here. So we just need to go through this process again. It's a bit tedious, but we just need to build our connection again. So that's going to be Postgres password. Let's go ahead and do that. So now in our databases, let's have a look in our book DB, schemas, and then tables. We have 2 new tables. So let's go ahead and just view these tables. You can see that we have all the fields that we've defined, and we've made our first migration. So we've gone from describing our table inside of our models to kind of hooking everything up using Alembic to actually control and manage the migrations. That's obviously made a migration file. We've migrated to our database. Okay, so the next thing we need to be able to do is actually send and get data from our database through our API. Okay, so we want to retrieve, or we want to receive data or allow people to post data to our API. So we're going to need to know, or we're going to need to be able to identify what data is being sent or posted to our API. And we want to make sure that that data matches our database schema so that we can insert it into the database. So what we're going to need to do now is build a schema using Pydantic here. So that kind of sums up what we're doing here essentially, but it'd be well worth reading into a little bit more, although it can feel a little bit abstract exactly what's going on here. So let's, pip install Pydantic. So yeah, to kind of reiterate, we're going to build a schema. So we're going to identify, we're going to describe what data we're going to receive from our post. So we're going to add data to our database. And we're going to essentially just make sure we validate that data, match it to our database so that we know that we can insert it. Right, so that's now installed. Okay, so we know that we're going to need to update our requirements and run a new image. So we'll do that shortly, but let's just go ahead now and build this up. So we're going to create a new file here called schemas.py. Okay, right, so in here we're going to need to describe what data we're going to receive. Right, so let's bring in Pydantic and import the base model. So here's just kind of almost a carbon copy of our models. So let me just I'll just paste this in. I've pre-written this. So if you remember, our class book has title, rating, author ID. We describe what type of data we're expecting, an integer and string. And then ORM mode is on, true, because we're using an ORM. Let's just define it like that. And then we've got the author that takes in the fields name and age. So we're expecting that. Now, in addition to this, remember our database does include a date field, but we don't need to pass that in. That's just going to be automatically generated. Right, so that's pretty much it really. That's going to be, that's just defining what we're going to accept or allow a user to kind of enter or post to our API. So now we've got that, let's go in now to our main. Let's create a new endpoint. So we're now going to create the endpoint for the adding a book, for example. So let's go ahead and do that. So there we go. Now you can see here the response model is schema book. Right, so what's that about? So we just kind of need to connect this up. So from models, or sorry, from schema, we're going to need to import book. So we're just going to import book as schema book. There we go. So what we're doing here is essentially we're saying, okay, let's allow people to post to this API endpoint, but the data must fit this schema that we've just described here. So if they want to insert a book, it must have a title, rating, and author ID. That's just how it must be. Right, so we've defined that now. So let's go ahead and finish this off. So we're going to create a new function here called add book. And then what we need to do is we need to define the data. So let's go ahead and do that. So db book equals model book, title book dot title, rating equals book dot rating, and author ID equals book author ID. So we're just basically aligning up the data that's being sent, title, rating, and author ID, over to the model book title, book rating, book ID. So hopefully that makes sense. So we're going to set that up, because essentially what we're going to do now is we're going to save it. So we're going to follow this path where we essentially prepare the data to be entered into the database, and then we're going to go ahead and actually commit the data to the database and then return. Okay, so this here just allows us to actually commit it to the database. Here we're preparing essentially the query so that we can then commit the data to the database. Right, so that's pretty much what's going on there. Now we're going to need to bring in a few things here for that to work properly. So let's go ahead now and bring in from FastAPI SQLAlchemy. So let's bring in the DB session middleware and DB. So that's going to allow us to kind of set up the connection to the database. So let's just bring that in. So here we're going to bring in from the environment variables, the database URL. Now that does mean we're going to need to load the .env file. So let's go ahead and load that in. Now in order to load that in, like we did previously, we're going to need to bring that in. So from .env, we're going to import and load .env. So we're going to bring in that. That's going to allow us to kind of load up our environment file, and then we can pass the parameter over here. Okay, so that essentially just adds and creates kind of database connectivity so we can perform this action of submitting or committing our data to the database. Okay, so this is probably feeling a little bit abstract at this point. There's a lot of things I'm just copy and pasting in, but hopefully you're getting the general flow of what's going on here. By all means, maybe just skip back if you need to. That's absolutely no problem. Right, so that's adding a book. Right, so we've added a book. So we've defined our schema here. We've kind of prepared all the data to be inserted. Just take a look at even if you don't quite understand, just have a look at the flow of what's happening here. And if you want to extend this, obviously what you're going to need to do, if you add a new field here in the book model, you're going to need to add a new item here. So for example, if you wanted to add here in the book, how many pages? So we would need to add pages here. You would need to add to the schema pages, and you would need to add to the model a new section called pages. So that's how you're going to extend utilizing those three sections there. Right, so now that's in place, let's go ahead and see if we can actually commit this. So I'm just wondering if I've done everything I need to do here. So what I probably need to do is just add my second endpoint, which is going to be the author. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing again. I'm just going to copy this in and I'll just give you a bit of commentary. So we'll do the same thing for the author. Now, obviously we've got a foreign key here, so the author needs to be added first. So you can see what's going on. We've got a schema author now. So what we're going to need to do up here is we're going to need to bring in from schema, import author as schema author. So let's bring that in. Okay, so that's our two schemas. So in addition to this, we do here select. Now remember, this is essentially a query that we're setting up here, and we're selecting the actual table that we want to actually utilize. So let's just change the scope slightly. So we're going to define book and model. So those are the two tables that we're utilizing. So we're going to need to bring in those. So from the top here, I've imported author and book into our project here. So yeah, this is essentially a query that we're going to run. We're going to pass in the name that's been passed in. I'm going to save that to author name, and the same age. In the age field, we're going to pass in the data and save it into the age field, similar to up here. So I've made those small changes. That's the database. We need to import those databases in. Right, so let's give this a go. So what we're going to need to do now is let's just go ahead. Let's just start. Now let's just delete all of this here. Let's just remove the app. We'll keep oh no, we're not going to be able to do that. So let's go ahead and just remove everything there. We'll start again. Right, and we'll just get rid of this image. Okay, so we didn't need to do that, but it just starts fresh. So let's go ahead now and compose up, Docker compose up. Let's rebuild this image and let's give this a go. So we've now got everything started. So we're going to need to go through this process again, remember, because we've created a new image. Therefore, we're now going to need to run our migration again. So let's go back into our command here. It's just all good practice. So let's run our migration, or make a migration, target database is not up to date. Right, good. Now, just to add a little bit more complexity to this, if you have this problem here, the problem here is that you've made a migration previously. What we tried to do there is make a new migration. That's not going to work because inside of this folder here, you've got a migration set. Now that is being read. So what's happening here? It's saying, well, no, everything is up to date. There's absolutely no problem. That might not be the case. So what we're going to need to do in actual fact is we're going to need to, let's just stop all these containers. Let's do this one more time. I'll just show you how to kind of clean this up. So Control C here, that's just going to stop those containers. Eventually we're going to be able to remove them. So let's just do this one more time. Right, so here in the Alembic folder, we've got versions. We're going to need to remove this migration. Let's just get rid of the cache as well. Yeah, let's just get rid of all the cache. Or cache. So that's now cleaned up nicely. So now let's go through that process again. Docker compose up. Let's just rebuild. And then once it's finished, now it says name OS is not defined. Wonderful. So if we go into this, well, in main, I think this is where the problem is. Here, oh no, maybe it's not. Yeah. We've defined OS somewhere, and it's not. Is it on this page? Yeah. Okay. So here, sorry, we've defined OS, but we didn't import OS in. That's my fault. Apologies. So I am kind of like falling into this slightly, and I do apologize. It doesn't make it very coherent. I do want there to be problems, in all honesty, because I want to show that there are problems and I want you to be able to fix them. So the only way for us to do that is to show you how to fix them. So here it clearly says OS is not defined. Here I'm clearly bringing in the OS. So that just gives me the whole reason for bringing that in. That is going to give me access to the operating system file system to allow me access to files and information within. So that brings in OS. Okay, so with that done, let's now, actually in fact that might work okay. It looks like it's started anyway. So that's all good. That's now being imported. So where are we? Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and make our migration again. Okay, so now our migration is being completed. So let's go ahead now and actually activate or commit our migration to the database. Now remember, we've made a new container. So we need to go through the process again and connecting up our admin again to it. But we can make the assumption that everything is okay in actual fact. So we don't need to worry about that. Right, so now we've done that, let's move on and give this a go. So we've got our endpoint. How do we know what endpoints we've got? Well, by default, you can see that if I go to my homepage and go to docs, we've got the Open API tool here, which is going to show us all the current endpoints we have on our system, which is great. So here is well documented. It tells us exactly our schema. So that's our schema that we've created. Now, if we change our schema in the file, this will change this here. So clearly identifies the schema that's expected, the data that's expected. So let's go ahead and go to our author. Let's try this out. So we'll just use that, execute. And it says here we've got a 200. So it looks like everything is absolutely fine. And then let's go to our book. Let's try this out. ID 1. We've got a 200 response. So it looks like it's working okay. We can try a 12. That should give us a 500 because there isn't an ID of 12. We've only got one author, and that's going to have an ID of 1. If we had 12 authors, that would probably work. Right, so our endpoints are working okay here. Everything looks like it's working okay. I'll make the assumption without going to PGAdmin that it's working for now, because we'll just go back into our code and we'll just go ahead now and make our final endpoint. So this final endpoint, I'll just paste this in. You can have a quick look. This is just going to grab all the data from our database. So here we've got DB session query. So we're going to create a query. We're going to query on books. We're going to get all the data from the database. This is our query. So we've already imported book. That's just describing the model. So we're just getting all the data and we're just going to return it. Should be as simple as that. So this is the endpoint /books, get books. So we're using get again. This is our query, and this is what we're going to return, the books data. Okay, so let's just give this a go. So it probably will just work like that. Books. And there we go. So we've entered one book into a database. We've retrieved and accessed that entry from our database through our API onto our front end, for example. Okay, so you can go ahead if you want and just refresh PGAdmin. I'll just take you through the process again if you need it. So admin@admin.com, that's what we set up, an admin password. We're going to need to go through that process, select server, object, create server, give it a name, DB. The connection is going to be DB, that's the name of our service, DB service in the Docker Compose file. We're going to have a username and password, username of Postgres. So remember, you can't change that. You'll need to add a new user into Postgres if you wanted to change that username. Press save, and here's the database. Here's our table, here's our schemas. We've got our tables, and we've added some data, so let's have a look. And there we go. So we don't actually have to run our app in Docker. We could just run this locally, of course. So let's just go ahead and add if name equals main. And then let's just run our Uvicorn server here. So this will just run locally. So what I can now do, let's just showcase this. So what I'm going to do is in the containers, let's go ahead and just close my app. I'm going to stop this app here. So we still want PGAdmin to run, of course, because we're going to need to access our database. So we'll just soft close that down. Hopefully that is stopping. Yep. Okay, so it's clearly our container is not running our app. So let's go ahead now and let's just go ahead and start our server here. So I'm just going to go into the virtual machine. Just activate that. So now I'm going to run. So py main.py. Here we go. So you can see that our server is running. There we go. So let's go into our server, or go into our browser, sorry. Let's have a look, and there we go. So it's working locally. So if you don't want to, for example, run this in a container, you can see that you can just easily run this now on your local machine. So that was a lot of information there in this tutorial, but hopefully you've seen how you can now start utilizing FastAPI to develop your API. Now, I want to say it's as simple as that. And for a lot of simple cases, I think, and I hope that that's pretty much all the information you're now going to need to kind of scale this up. At this point, you probably want to create your own models. So go ahead and create your own models. There might be some more kind of dependencies that you want to create, many-to-many fields or many-to-many connections, one-to-many or many-to-one connections. Go ahead and have a look at the SQLAlchemy guidelines. That would take you through how to kind of build those. And of course, then you just need to update your schemas. And at this point, you're now going to ask me about security and so on. So maybe in future sessions or future tutorials, we can go through this process depending on how popular this tutorial is. Depends on whether we need to look at this, because most of the tutorials in this channel are obviously Django and Django DRF. So it's completely up to you. If we get enough response, maybe we can have a look at some other aspects of FastAPI. So let me know how you get on. If you have any problems, let me know in the comments. I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I do hope to see you in the next tutorial.